Joining me now, NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli, Boston Globe columnist Kim Atkins-Storr, and Clinton School of Public Service Dean Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. So, Mike, give me some reaction to that White House event. You don't often see invited guests in the Rose Garden, yelling out to the president.
Yeah, you're right, Andrea. I think in one event this morning, you have a real encapsulation of all the cross currents facing this White House at this very important political moment. On the one hand, the president wanting to clearly celebrate what the administration believes is a genuine accomplishment worth celebrating. Yes, the president had to sign this gun safety bill into law 2 weeks ago, just before he left for the NATO summit. As Congress had already left town, you want to have the kind of event for a piece of legislation of this nature with the lawmakers involved, with, as the president noted, so many advocates for gun safety measures who are among those family members of people who were killed by gun violence. They are such an important part of the advocacy that got to this point. But then, of course, you have in Manuel Oliver somebody who speaks to the fact that there is great frustration that more needs to be done. Now, it should be said, the president himself used most of his remarks following that moment to speak exactly to that fact. He said he would not rest until an assault weapons ban is passed into law, like the one that he was able to pass as Senator Joe Biden, chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 1994. He talked about a number of other steps that he also wants to be taken, expanded background checks and the like. But also interesting to note, Andrea, as there is this new New York Times poll speaking to concerns within the Democratic Party about Joe Biden as the standard bearer in 2024. You had in the audience today, and just a few minutes ago, I was with him as he was walking back into the West Wing, the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. He is among many Democrats, frankly, who have said that they will not rule out potentially running should potentially President Biden not seek the renomination of his party in 2024. Also, there's consideration the fact that there are some who may well challenge the president. Now, the fact of the president's age, he will turn 80 this November. He would be 86 at the end of, should he complete a second term. As one White House official put it to me just a few weeks ago, there's nothing short of a time machine that the White House can do to change the fact that the president is as old as he is. But one of the things they do plan to do in the months ahead, as they said, this is something you can only show, you can't tell. The president will get out on the road quite a bit more once he returns from his Mideast trip next week as part of an active engagement ahead of the midterm elections. It's that kind of public demonstration of his stamina, of his skills, they believe, as a retail politician that will ultimately be better, and the only thing they can do, frankly, to quiet that discontent rather than anything that they can say publicly at this stage, Andrea.
Yeah, and they've had some unintentional mistakes also in messaging, because in addition, you've got people, Kim Atkins-Storr, that are not happy about the way he responded to the abortion decision. Now, arguably, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court, and there's nothing he could do about it. But they think that the White House should have been more proactive. They still want the national public health crisis to be announced, which they are considering. But I just wanted to read something that Kate Bedingfield said from the White House, which upset some of the abortion rights protesters who were all here on Saturday, and there were some other protests around the country. She said that Joe Biden's goal in responding to Dobbs, which was the Mississippi case, is not to satisfy some activists who have been consistently out of step with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Well, that precipitated a question to the president when he was starting a bike ride in Rehoboth at his beach house this weekend.
Yes, keep protesting, because keep making your point. It's critically important. We can do a lot of things to accommodate the rights of women in the meantime, but fundamentally, the only thing that's going to change this is if we have a national law. And my ultimate goal is to reinstate Roe v. Wade as a national law by passing it in the United States Congress, and I'll sign it the moment that happens.
So, Kimberly, the question to him as he started that bike ride was, does he have a message for all these protesters who are out and, marching and in some cases trying to handcuff themselves to the fence outside the White House? But how risky is it to tell protesters, to tell Democrats, that their only option is to vote?
Yeah, I think this shows one of the main issues that Biden has, which is, and this White House has, which is a failure to really see the urgency and act with the urgency that the American people need. Look, I think that voters understand, and those who are polled in that poll understand what the White House can and cannot do. But at the same time, you saw it took some time before Biden really embraced passing the Roe Act and getting rid of the filibuster in order to do that. It took a long time before the White House proposed some other federal action that, even if that in itself would not solve the problem of Roe v. Wade being overturned, it would demonstrate that the White House understands what Americans are feeling. I think it's the same thing with the gun issue. Joe Biden is somebody who likes to talk about the economy, who likes to talk about things like kitchen table issues. Well, at this point, things like reproductive rights and gun violence is at America's kitchen table. And the fact that there hasn't been that urgency, the president had he said there's nothing you can do about the Supreme Court. He had an entire commission looking at ways to reform the Supreme Court, and they essentially shrugged and disbanded. That's what he's fighting against now. And I think if other challengers come with clear messages about how to address those things from the Democratic side, that can pose a real problem for him.